Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First of all of you, each and every one of you, should have a pen, which has been provided to us by Bushy Promotions. That's Lorraine, who can't be with us today. These are pens which light up to let you find the key when you get home. They're not laser pens to take me out if you think I've been going on for too long. Now, this talk I've been doing for a few years, and it's not any form of promotion for any one particular religion. It's all about facts and fables, why we do things at this festive period. We've just celebrated the wonderful feast of Diwali, and this year, for the first time since 2005, Hanukkah, the Jewish festival, starts on Christmas Eve, the same time as our Christian festival. That won't happen again until 2035, unless, of course, this government changes things, which they're quite likely to do anyway. I often start a talk by saying, what is this festive period? 2,000 years ago, we'd have been celebrating the Feast of Saturnalia, which is a pagan festival. And the pagans decorated their houses with greenery. They had lamps. They didn't have candles, because candles didn't come in until the 1500s. They had parties and lots of drinking and eating. So not dissimilar to what we are likely to be doing over the next few weeks. But then in the 4th century, the Roman Catholic Church came along and said, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to put Christmas on the back of Saturnalia, because Saturnalia, the pagans worshipped Baal, the sun god, which is a little baby. And they believed by doing that, the long nights, the winter nights, would get shorter and shorter, and the sun would come back. And they could then plant their crops and be successful. And it worked year after year after year, and it hasn't stopped, has it? I often talk about Rudyard Kipling, the elephant child. I keep 6 honest working men, I know not what they do. Their names are what and why and when, and how and when and who. At the end of each one of those is a question mark. The question is, where did the question mark come from? It's almost like saying, if you're going to send some bubble wrap to somebody, what do you wrap it in? Thought about that one? Well, the question mark comes from the Latin quaestio. And originally it was a circle with a line through it, rather like the Q&A, which we see even now. But then as time evolved, they took a bit of that circle, dropped it down below, and put a dot underneath it. That dot is called an iota. And so when we say, I don't give an iota, that's exactly what it means. I don't give a little dot. When we're doing a talk, we have to think about presentation. And unfortunately, Graham Le Gall isn't here today, because he often goes on about the 7 Ps, and we've all heard about that: perfect presentation, etc., etc. And how are we going to communicate a message? The message of Christmas, the message in our businesses. We're going to talk. Hopefully, we're going to listen. We can communicate by writing a letter. And do you remember the opportunities which we used to have of going down to the stationers and getting a lovely box of Basildon Bond and some envelopes, and then getting your best Waterman's pen out and writing to your great aunt who'd sent you a nice crispy £1 note or a £5 note for your birthday? You had to do it, didn't you? Now, of course, we do emails, which can be okay, providing they are still used. Writing as a letter: Dear Colin, thank you for, and yours sincerely. I do hate this, Colin. How impersonal is that? It's an Americanism. And I think the sooner we stop that, we better stop doing it. We can communicate by email. The internet is a wonderful thing. But what if we can't actually hear? What if we can't see? All these marketing people, occasionally, of course, you see, you could have a document sent in Braille. Louis Braille, the Frenchman, was the person who really brought modern Braille writing for the visually impaired into being. But then we have people who are deaf and dumb. They need to do signage, don't they? It was a monk, a Benedictine monk, Passion de Leon, who is the modern inventor of sign language. And he invented this so that he could train his pupils in the monastery. But it's quite limited in what he could do. And then it was a Frenchman, Leip, who's another French cleric, who modernised sign language and introduced the first public school in France for those people who were unable to hear and to speak. Lots of other knowledgeable people have improved on it, but those two are the basics. We've got to somehow communicate sometimes a message urgently. And how was that done before the internet? 1939, before the Second World War, the government said when the church bells ring out through England, beware, because we are about to be invaded. And Captain Mannering and his chaps would all go running out and defend this country. Church bells, church clocks, were a way of communicating the time. Church bells would ring through on weddings, on funerals. A way of communicating. In 1588, Philip of Spain decided he would rock up and try and invade us, the Spanish Armada. Francis Drake was down on Plymouth Hoe having a game of bowls. And he said, well, don't worry, the wind's going in the wrong direction. They won't get here for another 2 days. I'm going to finish my game. Queen Elizabeth I, she was sitting on the throne at the time. Well, not literally. But that's another story. She was having a luncheon of goose. And she said that goose was to be eaten at every Christmas luncheon from there on. But unfortunately, not many people could afford it. And so it didn't happen for many, many years. It was, in fact, her godson who did invent the first flush toilet in this country. So hence we have the expression, somebody sitting on the throne. We had knowledge that the Spanish Armada was turning up by beacons being lit throughout the country. Well, beacons are okay at night, but they're not a lot of good in the daytime. And so they had to be dampened down, and so we had smoke. It was all right, providing there wasn't any fog. But the idea of using smoke signals wasn't entirely new. The North Americans, as we know, they'd been doing it for years and years and years. And even going back to the Chinese dynasties and the Aztecs, they used smoke signals to give a warning. Just down the road from here is a town called Beaconsfield. And many a person goes down there looking for a big field full of beacons. There have never, ever been any beacons in Beaconsfield, apart from when they celebrated the Queen's Jubilee a few years ago, when 3,500 beacons were lit throughout the whole of the UK and throughout the Commonwealth. It was in 1191 was the first recording of Beaconsfield, but then it was called Beaconsfeld, a field, a clearing in a forest of beech trees. Just down the road, of course, we've got Burnham Beeches. So that is very, very similar. And that's where all of that comes from. So if we're going to communicate, we've got modern technology, but then in those days, we had to communicate on land. But what if we're at sea? How do you communicate? Well, I'm going to come on to that in just a minute. But the idea of smoke signals gave an idea to a Frenchman, Claude Lefel, who thought, I know what I'll do. I'll have a system called semaphore. He was a cleric. He was also an engineer. And he set up this system of a lot of signs. And if anybody was in the Boy Scouts, they were possibly, or Girl Guides, I remember, system of semaphore. It comes from the Greek. Sema, a word, for is to transmit. He set up a system of towers throughout France. They were distanced at about 20, 30, 40 kilometres, depending on the terrain. And so we have a chap sitting on the top of this with a telescope, waiting for a message. He would then relay it onto the next one, and we relayed right the way through. And before he died, when he took his own life, there were 700 of these towers throughout France. But they were quite innovative at the time, because when the Austrians decided to invade France in one particular year, they were able to transmit a message that the Austrians had been seen off within 1 hour, that distance. It would have taken a horse rider between 10 and 12 hours to make that same journey. So that was quite advanced technology, really, wasn't it? In a way. So there we are, we're on land. Another wonderful French invention, communicating with sound. If any of you have seen Second World War films, you will see the lights on warships being flashed to each other, light, ... communicating. That's very old-fashioned, isn't it, really? Well, no, surprisingly enough, it's not. It's still used by the British Navy today. When we send our warships off on long journeys, they can't always carry enough food and supplies and fuel for what they've got to do. The aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth needs 7 million litres of fuel. Can you imagine getting the air miles or the nectar points on that lot? I'd love some of that. So they have to have what they call a RAS. That's a replenishment at sea. So the two ships come along, they throw a line over and they transmit. So they convey all the food from the supply ship onto the receiving ship. But during all of that time, they don't use any mobile phones, they don't use any technology. They use semaphore, because it is so safe to do that, and there can be no misunderstanding. At night time, when we send our ships into war zones such as the China Sea, and the Chinese ships or the Russian ships are trying to look for us, they can see us during the daytime, but at night we can confuse them. They can see us on the radar. So what do? We turn the radar off, and their screens go totally blank. And our ships can go wherever they want to. They still need to be able to communicate. And they communicate in code by using Morse code with those flashing lights. One Christmas carol, one Christmas song, which is a code, is the 12 Days of Christmas. Many people don't realise, oh, that's a nice little song, the first day of Christmas, my true love sent to me, etc., etc. Nobody knows who actually wrote it, but it came in round about 1600. It was during the time that Roman Catholicism was banned in this country for about 200 years, apart from when James I was on the throne for a short time. First day of Christmas, my true love, and came about because a priest said, we're being suppressed, but we want the children to know all about the important things about our religion. And so this little rhyme came up. The first day of Christmas, my true love sent to me a partridge in a pear tree, Jesus Christ. 2 turtle doves, the Old and the New Testament. Fourth day of Christmas, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, 10 days, the 10 Commandments. So it is all bound up in a bit of mystery. When Admiral Lord Nelson decided to have a little battle down in 1805 on the 21st of October, he sent a message to everybody in the fleet England expects every man to do his duty. A few years before that, at the Battle of the Nile, he'd lost his eyesight. And that didn't worry him really. He was still a good sailor. A few years later, at the Battle of Copenhagen, he was under the command of a chap called White. And the Admiral said, "Send a signal, do not attack until I give the go-ahead." And Nelson said to his second in command, "Who sent that signal?" He said, "The Admiral, sir." He said, "Damn it, Foley, I haven't come all this way not to have a damn battle. Give me that telescope." He held it up. And of course, he held it up to his blind eye. He said, "I see no signal. We shall attack immediately." And they did, and he gave the Dutch a good seeing to. And that's where we get the expression, doing a Nelson. I don't want to talk too much about the sea, but it all comes back to planning. Here is a chart. And when I go sailing, I need this chart because it tells me the depth of water, details of any shipwrecks, any sands, any rocks. It's very important that I have to do my planning. And here, collision at sea regulations, in there, it tells me how to identify other vessels. At night time, of course, it's easy because you have lights. The lights which are on his ship will tell you the length of the ship, what sort of ship it is. On the left, you're going to have red, which is the port side. Right is the starboard side. White light at the back means it's the back. So if you're out at sea sailing and you see this at night, you've got red on the left, green on the right, white on the back, it's okay because you're following somebody. If the other way round, you get out of the way because they're coming towards you. In the daytime, if you're on a sailing boat, two white little things called a mast, sails. That says you're a sailing boat. And the rules of the road, and it's all in here. So if you see somebody coming towards you, when you're not quite sure, you make a precise movement to one side or the other. That means the other person lets you know what you're doing, what your intentions are. If you are then needing a little more wind, you turn the engine on. But that means you're no longer a sailing boat, but you're a motor vessel, and you have to abide by the rules and regulations for motor vessels. And you let other people know that by simply going down into the locker and getting a black triangle, an inverted triangle, and hoisting it up the mast. And that tells everybody you are now a motor vessel, or even though you've got those white things flapping around, the sails. However, if you haven't done your homework, you haven't done your planning, and you end up in the rocks, you have to do the very, very embarrassing thing. You have to go down into the locker and get 3 big black balls out. And you have to take them up to the top of the mast. And you've got 3 black balls. And that demonstrates to everybody you haven't done your planning and you're in a balls up situation. So we've got a lot of lights going around at Christmas, and it communicates that we're now in the festive season. Lights on Christmas trees. Where do they come from? You see, Martin Luther, he was a Protestant reformer. He was walking through the fields in Germany one night. The snow was down on the ground. It was very frosty, full moon, and the moon was throwing its light down onto the branches. And he snapped off his branches and he took them into his house where his 3 daughters were, and he gave it to them and said, "Look at this, how marvellous it is." And for a while, they glistened in front of the fire, but then, of course, they melted. It gave him the idea of putting candles onto a Christmas tree, and that's where they all started, all those many, many years ago. The biggest tree, of course, in this country is in Trafalgar Square every year. It is donated by the people of Oslo, in the capital of Norway, really in gratitude and as a memorial of an event which happened in 1940. King Haakon and his family were under threat of being captured by the Germans. And so we sent 3 battleships into Norway to recover them. 451 people, including the royal family and other leading dignitaries, were put onto the lead ship, HMS Glasgow, who went away and brought them back to England. Unfortunately, the 2 support ships which were there were sunk by the German Navy at the loss of 1,941 lives. And so that is the gratitude of the people of Norway. That tree is decorated every year with 400 lights. As we move further down into London, we have Regent Street and Oxford Street. There are 600,000 light bulbs in those decorations. And for those of you who may remember the old style systems, when one bulb went, you had to go right the way around the system. Thank heavens we don't have to go through that now. Go down to Piccadilly Circus, full of lights, advertising. The first advertising, the first neon sign, was in 1908, and that was actually Perrier water. It was a static sign. It was about 10 years later, they got a bit more sophisticated. We had moving neon signs, and that was Bovril. Now, many American tourists turns up and says, "Hey, where's this circus? I ain't seen no circus down here." Never has been one. Never has been a circus down there. Comes from the Latin, circle, circui. And there was a tailor down there called John Baker. He was quite notorious in his time, probably a bit of the early people of Carnaby Street, really, I suppose, in a way. And he designed a particular type of collar. And that collar was called a Piccadilly. And he made a lot of money selling these collars. So much so that he was able to build a very, very big house on the circle. He called it Piccadilly House. And over the period of time, Piccadilly House became Piccadilly Circus. And just up the road, ladies had their hats made, milliners. But the gents also needed hats. Now, if I ask anybody around this table, Mad Hatter, what do you think of? Alice in Wonderland. Nothing to do with it. Well, it might do in a way, I suppose. The hats in their manufacture had to use a lot of mercury. And mercury was bubbling away in little pots in the workshops where these people worked. And the fumes got into their system, got into their brains, and made them mad. Somebody who wasn't quite the ticket in those days, who worked in that profession, they were referred to as mad as a hatter. So let's just nip over to the continent. How are they going to celebrate Christmas with all the lights and sounds? In Salzburg on Christmas Eve at 12 o'clock, the guns of the big castle in Salzburg boom out, the big cannons, to start Christmas. And all the shops and all the offices, they close down for 2 whole days to celebrate. The people go back to their homes to get ready for Christingle, the Christingle fairy who brings all the presents. And nobody is allowed, it's against the law, to open on Christmas Day or St. Stephen's Day. More about St. Stephen in a minute. Sorry, Mr. Patel, you ain't opening. End of story. Now, down in the Birkenstall Valley in Bavaria, at 11:30 on Christmas Eve, there's about 1,200 members of a particular guild of gunsmiths. And they have these little hand cannons, the Hansboller. They're miniature cannons. And they start firing these cannons at 11:30, just a few at a time. until the crescendo comes up and at midnight all hell lets loose with 7,000 rounds of gunshots to celebrate that Christmas has started. They do the same thing in the New Year, and if there's a wedding in the village at 4 o'clock in the morning, they start this shooting, and it goes on for every hour until the wedding takes place. We've moved on to New Year. New Year is celebrated in many ways throughout the country and throughout the world. In parts of South America, you will see people walking around with empty suitcases. Now, they're not Mad Hatters, but they believe, this is a tradition, a belief, that if they walk around with an empty suitcase, their luck will take them travelling for the following year. The Copacabana Beach, 2.5 million people go on the Raz down there to celebrate New Year. In Japan, they ring 108 bells every family. That's to get rid of 108 deadly sins which they believe they are capable of, they may have done or they're going to do in the past, in the future. We all make New Year's resolutions, don't we? Well, that isn't entirely new. The Babylonians did it many, many years ago. And they made a resolution that what they would do is that they would return the farm implements which they had borrowed off their neighbour the previous year. It's a very, very simple thing, really. The knights in this country who were loyal to the Lord of the Manor, they take an oath of allegiance to the Lord of the Manor for the next 12 months by putting a pledge on a peacock. That's a New Year's resolution for them. The Romans had a god, Janus, and this is where we get January. A face half looking that way, half looking that way. Half looking at the year just gone, half looking for the year ahead. And interesting, the Roman calendar only had 10 months. Now, when are we going to celebrate Christmas and the New Year? 25th of December or the 6th of January? The Russian Orthodox Church will celebrate their Christmas on the 6th of January. Why? Well, it all goes back to Pope Gregory XIII. In 1583, he was sitting in the Vatican. He was a bit bored, so he called his cardinals in and said, look, he said, I've been looking at this Julian calendar. I think it's a bit wrong to me. Go away and see what you can do. Come back, please. So they came back and they said, yes, actually, you're absolutely right. It's wrong by a good number of days, by 10 days, 12 hours, 13 minutes and 2 seconds approximately. He said, well, all right, I'll tell you what we'll do. On the 15th of October this year, we're going to make that the 25th of October, all right? So he sent out this Pope mail to all of Europe, because they're all Roman Catholics in the whole of Europe at that time, and said, this is what you're going to do. But we didn't in England, because we were Protestants and we were not going to, or we were a Protestant country, not going to have anything to do with it. And so for 180 years, England and Scotland were out of sync with the rest of Europe. And then we passed the Calendar Act 180 years later to bring us into line with the rest of Europe. So we're going to celebrate Christmas on the 25th. And as we sit maybe on Christmas Eve, or maybe Hanukkah, whichever way we're going to do it, we sit back and think, have we planned for everything? Have we got everything in place that we need for the festivities? Have we got the turkey, if we're going to have turkey? Is it defrosted? Unlike Dave and his wife in the royal family, if you've ever never seen that, it's absolutely worth watching. So we've got the turkey. Turkey's got to be stuffed. Why do we stuff a turkey? Well, the Romans did it back in the 1st century. And in the 5th century, there's a lovely old Roman cookery book, which you can have a look at. You can buy it on Amazon. It tells you all about stuffing. Rabbits, pigs, deer, chicken, and dormice. Dormice were a speciality in those Roman times. And in fact, in Slovenia, in Eastern Europe, it is still considered a delicacy. I've not tried it myself, and I don't intend to. So we've got the turkey. And I suppose, what are we going to have with it? Well, maybe we ought to have some cranberry sauce. Cranberries are not native to this country. They come from Eastern America, from the marshlands, and it was in the mid-1800s that an American cookery writer, a bit like modern-day Delia Smith, I suppose, came up with this recipe for cranberry sauce. Just going back to stuffing, sage and onion stuffing was first introduced into this country in 1901 by a Manchester butcher. That is now Paxo stuffing. And the celebrity chef on MasterChef, not Greg Wallace, the other one, the one with the beard, he still said, Marcus Waring says that's still his favourite stuffing for his Christmas lunch. Would you believe it? He can have everything else he wants, but that's his favourite stuffing. He said it's Christmas isn't Christmas without Paxo sage and onion stuffing. So we need a few potatoes, don't we? Roast potatoes. Potatoes are not native to this country. Walter Raleigh brought those over, allegedly, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And these were quickly followed by peas being put on the plate. Bird's eye? No. 3,500 years ago, they were being farmed by the Chinese. Brussels sprouts, now love them or hate them, they're here to stay. The Romans were cultivating these back in their days, and they obviously get their name from the city of Brussels, who became rather keen on the idea, and there are 120 varieties of Brussels sprouts. Now, we've got Belgium to think a lot of, haven't we, really? We've got Brussels sprouts, chocolate, Poirot, and Olivier, who can't be here today. After that, I suppose we've got to have Christmas pudding. But Christmas pudding wasn't always a sweet dish, such as we will enjoy today, with all those different fruits in it. It was a savoury dish, and it was just vegetables, a few bits of meal put in together, made into a round ball, put into muslin, dropped into the village cook shop for about 8 hours, steamed, and that's all that people had. It was only after the traders came back from the West Indies and brought back these wonderful spices that it became very much a sweet dish. But it did have a few problems, because people loved it, and they made mince pies out of it, this lovely mixture. And the earlier ones were in the shape of a crib. Then Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans came in and said, that's it, we're going to ban Christmas, we don't like it. It's wrong, you've got to open, you cannot close down. So the Puritans and the Calvinists, or the Church of Scotland, they banned Christmas altogether. However, what Cromwell hadn't reckoned on was the good men of Kent, from Canterbury, where I come from. I'm a man of Kent, I'm very proud of that fact. They said, we're not having any of this. We're going to celebrate. So Cromwell sent a lot of troops down there for the Canterbury Plum riots. But the good men of Kent gave them a good spanking, and they went off with their tail between their legs. It was after the restoration to the monarchy that Christmas was reintroduced. In England it was, but not in Scotland. Christmas Day only became a public holiday in 1957. What are we going to have after Christmas pudding? Well, we've had Christmas, we've had our mince pies. Let's have some Stilton cheese. Stilton is a town in Huntingdon, and Stilton can only be manufactured with the name of Stilton with 3 counties: Northampton, Cambridgeshire, and one other county, I've forgotten which one it is. But that's the one they have to. So Stilton. Well, I think we better have a glass of port with that, hadn't we? That's rather a nice drink, but where did port come from? Well, we've got to thank Louis XVI for that, the French king. Well, not him particularly, but one of his officials, who decided that he wanted to raise a bit of money for the king, and so he decided to put on a lot of taxes and imports for goods from England. And our king said, we're not having this. We are not going to import any more French wine. You can shove it. But we needed to find a replacement. And the wine which was most suitable came from Portugal, from the Douro Valley. That suited the taste of the English palate. But the wine had to come down from the Douro Valley, down to a Porto, be put onto ships to come over to England. And by the time it got here, it was pretty rank. And so 2 guys one day decided just to add a little bit of grape juice, brandy, to that wine, fortify it, and so it could last the long journey back to England. And so we've got our Christmas meal sorted out, haven't we? And as we sit down on Christmas Eve, one of my favourite carols I love goes back to 1818, when a young pastor in the village of Ulbersdorf in Germany went up to his church to prepare for the Christmas Eve service. And unfortunately, he hadn't used the services of Dave from Old Bill's Pest Control, and somebody had got into some mice or rats had got into the bellows of the organ, and he couldn't play it. So he went down and saw his friend Franz Gruber, who was a guitarist, a guitar teacher, and said, I wrote this poem a few years ago. Would you please find some music so we can sing it tonight in church? Within a few hours, he'd put together this wonderful Christmas carol, Stille Nacht, Helle Nacht, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs at this time of the year. But it was 100 years later, near enough, the First World War, the trenches on the first Christmas Eve of the Great War, the war to end all wars, the war which will be over by Christmas. The 1st Battalion, the Welsh Fusiliers, were sitting down in their trenches. It's cold, it's bitter, hugging their cocoa. The officers would come round and give them a bit of rum to keep their spirits up. And over the trenches, they heard this carol from the German troops, Stille Nacht, Helle Nacht. At the end of it, the voice came over the trenches and said, "Hey, Tommy, your turn now." And they decided to give them good belting of good King's Wenceslas. Wenceslas, who was he? Who was Stephen? Stephen was the first Christian martyr, 5th century. Wenceslas was the son of a Bohemian warrior who'd lost his life, and Wenceslas had him and his brother, Boleslav, were brought up in 2 families. Wenceslas was brought up by his grandmother, who was a committed Christian. Boleslav was brought up by his mother, who was very much anti-Christian, and they conspired to have Wenceslas murdered as he went to church in September, around about 985. But Boleslav was so full of guilt of what he'd done that he had a statue of his brother on horseback mounted in the middle of Wenceslas Square in Prague, and that is where there is a big circle down there. I should have mentioned that the first Christmas tree was in Tallinn in Estonia in 1537. That's the first recorded Christmas tree. It was a society called the Blackheads Brotherhood, a bit like early day Rotary, I suppose, but they were merchants, they had to be single, and they had to have a beard. So that's where the first recorded Christmas tree is. So hopefully we've got all of that in place. And whether or not we're celebrating Hanukkah, we're celebrating Christmas, or we're just celebrating it because we want to be with our friends, hopefully we've got all that planning in place and we won't end up with the festive balls up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Oh, as fascinating and interesting as ever. So we're looking forward to the recording because I was trying to take it all in. Yeah. I think, oh my God, I miss this, and whatever. Thank you. Amazing.
Pleasure.
That's very good.
Thank you
you.
so much.